Mighty Joe Young tells the story of this young woman named Jill Young, played by Terry Moore, who as a child found and kind of purchased without her father's approval a baby gorilla that she decided to name Joe. So as the years go by, she becomes a young woman, and Joe has become a larger than normal gorilla, and the two of them just basically live on this African ranch. Suddenly, J. Jonah Max O'Hara, played by Robert Armstrong, comes to Africa and discovers Joe because he wants to open a safari-themed nightclub in LA, and he figures that Joe would be perfect for that club. So Jill and Joe agree to go to Hollywood and perform, but as time goes on, they start to grow tired and disinterested in performing there. Pretty much, it's like King Kong, but without King Kong. Yes, I know that this is not a King Kong movie, so why am I reviewing this with all the other Kong movies? Well, the reason is because this was made by the same people that made King Kong. Ernest Schoedsack and Marion C. Cooper, and Willis O'Brien even does the stop-motion animation, and the plot's very similar. So because it's tied so closely to the original King Kong, I would feel weird if I didn't review it. Unlike King Kong, I didn't see this movie until just now to do this review. So I had expectations that it was going to be really good, but not as good as the original King Kong was. And I was right. This is a really charming and more family-friendly version of King Kong. Like King Kong, the big show stealer here is the stop-motion animation by Willis O'Brien, and one of his assistants on board was actually Ray Harryhausen, and this was pretty much Harryhausen's big break. He, of course, would go on to do stuff like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Jason and the Argonauts, Clash of the Titans, and many other movies. But Mighty Joe Young was his big break, and you can kind of see some of his stop-motion techniques within the animation, even though Willis O'Brien is technically the main guy behind the animation. But in this movie, they've actually perfected the craft of stop-motion animation that Willis O'Brien did in The Lost World and King Kong, to the point where there are a lot of things in here that make you go, how did they do that? The first time we ever see Joe, he's interacting with this real lion in a cage, and you really do believe that Joe is interacting with this real lion. Then there's a scene where he's fighting a bunch of O'Hara's men on horses, and it's all real horses, real men, and you're just marveling at how impressive it looks. There are some points where you can definitely see where Joe was composited into the sequence, but most of the time you're just marveling at it like, wow, that is incredible. When we go to the nightclub, there are two scenes that stick out to me in terms of how did they do that. One is when Joe is holding up Jill on a piano, and the other is when he's playing tug-of-war with a group of strongmen, and you have a stop-motion gorilla pulling one side of the rope while the strongmen are pulling the other side, and they're real. And then one of the strongmen starts punching Joe, and Joe knocks the strongman over, who falls into the water, and it's just all really great. And it was also a smart decision to film this in black and white, because if they'd done this in color, and this also applies for the original King Kong, some of the compositing shots would have been a lot more obvious. But with black and white, it's easier to hide it. Another thing that's really similar to King Kong is that Robert Armstrong is also in this movie, playing Max O'Hara, who is almost the same as Carl Denham, even though it's a completely different character, but the way he looks reminds me very much of J. Jonah Jameson, and the way he acts is just like J. Jonah Jameson as well, which made me think that if Spider-Man had been invented in the 40s or late 30s rather than the 60s, Robert Armstrong would have been a perfect J. Jonah Jameson. Is it possible to build a time machine, kidnap Robert Armstrong from 1949, and just put him into the Marvel Cinematic Universe as J. Jonah Jameson? Can we do that? No? Balls. When you watch this movie, you will, without a doubt, think J. Jonah Jameson. The rest of the characters may not be as memorable as Robert Armstrong, but they are still likable, especially Terry Moore as Jill. She's kind, compassionate, and she's willing to put her foot down in scenarios that she doesn't feel to be right. I don't have much to say about this movie. Again, the big thing that makes this movie great is the stop-motion animation. If I did have one problem with it, it's that the climax feels a bit shoehorned in. What happens in the finale is that Jill and Max O'Hara are supposed to get Joe away from being executed after he causes destruction in the club. So they get away, but then they come across this burning orphanage or schoolhouse. It's something that comes out of nowhere, and all of a sudden the movie has this orange tint to it. And it's pretty much like when you watch The Dark Knight on Blu-ray, and you see the aspect ratios changing when it comes to the IMAX sequences. It feels like that here. It suddenly changes from black and white to this orange tint during this out of nowhere climax, which is fun to watch and often thrilling, but again, it feels kind of forced. And once that sequence ends, it goes back to black and white, and your eyes have to adjust to it. When I saw this movie on DVD for the first time, I thought it was a screw up on the DVD, but then I saw images of the new Blu-ray they released a couple years ago, and I was like, oh, that's really part of the movie. That's not an accident on my DVD. That's actually the movie. So again, it was a bit distracting, but on a whole, I think Mighty Joe Young is a really fun, entertaining, and charming movie. Nowhere near as great as the original King Kong, but still very good. So I definitely say that's worth seeing in your lifetime. And if you have kids, this is a great movie to show them. It's not directly aimed at kids, but it is a more family-friendly version of King Kong, because I think the original King Kong is a little too intense for like little kids, like around 5 years old, I'd say. Mighty Joe Young is definitely a good movie to get them into the King Kong spirit. And I can understand why Disney remade it, because the original was family friendly, and that's what Disney was back then in the 90s, so makes a lot of sense. So again, the original is really good and worth checking out. And that's my review for Mighty Joe Young. Next Wednesday, we'll be back to the eighth wonder of the world when I review the 1976 remake of King Kong. So until then, I hope you enjoyed this review. Leave a comment down below and tell me what your thoughts are on Mighty Joe Young, if and when you've seen it. And as always, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one.